At first, I wanted to go about this case in the same way I do with other serial killers. But the more I found out, the more I realized this one is very different from, let's say, Ted Bundy or Ed Kemper. Let me ask you, why do you think the concept of power is so often linked to the concept of evil? What is power and what is evil to you? I want you to keep these questions in mind throughout this video and tell me in the comments if you were able to find an answer by the end. What I'm going to tell you next is not only one of the most atrocious cases in Mexican history, but it's a perfect example of the relationship between evil and power. I'm going to tell you how a serial killer became the leader of a cult that had the backing of politicians, celebrities, and cartel leaders. How a man used the allure of the occult to gain riches and influence while committing crimes with complete impunity. This is the case of Adolfo Constanzo and the Narcosatanists of Matamoros. Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo was born on November 1st, 1962 in Miami, Florida. He was the son of Cuban parents who had fled to the United States during the violent era of the Cuban Revolution. His mother, Delia Gonzalez, was 15 years old when she gave birth to him. His father, whose identity is unknown, died a year later. His father's death didn't trouble him at all due to his young age and because his mother made sure to quickly find him another father figure. The boy, his mother, and his grandma moved to Puerto Rico after his father's death, where Delia met a successful businessman who quickly became her new husband and was the man who actually took on the role of father for Constanzo. This stage of Constanzo's life is the most important for understanding how his mind functioned as an adult, as is frequently the case with this type of criminals. So let's go step by step. Delia and her mother, Constanzo's grandmother, were known as actual witches in the circles they frequented, being part of a religion called Palo Machombe, which the boy was made part of basically from the moment he was born. Just how like a lot of us in Latin America are raised as Catholics, Constanzo was raised as a palero, which is how people who practice Palo Machombe are called. This usually wouldn't be a problem in and of itself, but Palo Machombe is not a religion like Catholicism. In Palo, there is no concept of sin, of good and evil. It's not about virtue, rather, power is valued above all else. The qualities sought in a palero are cunning, strength, and quick decision making. Furthermore, not everyone can be part of it. Only those who are deemed worthy of commanding the spirits of the dead. Religion is, in most cases, the first thing we have as children that acts as a sort of moral compass. The first point of reference that we have about what's morally good or evil. So being exposed to Palo Machombe from such a young age naturally led Constanzo to adopt an elitist demeanor and a disdain for anything that seemed like a sign of weakness. This disposition was further exacerbated by his mother, who constantly told him that he was a boy with special powers, someone with control over the spirits and superior to others. Delia made it clear from a very young age that he shouldn't consider the feelings of others if they got in the way of his ambitions, that it was his divine right to do as he pleased. And, as if that wasn't enough to convince her son, she regularly took him on trips to Haiti to learn more about the occult, making him believe that he was destined to become a very powerful witch and that he should prepare for it. Our dear Delia wasn't exactly a model mother figure, as you're probably thinking, but she's only the first piece of the puzzle. Let's move on to the second, his adoptive father. As I mentioned before, this man was a businessman with a lot of money. He was often seen ordering around employees and was highly respected by those around him. Not to mention that he provided Constanzo and his mother with a life of luxury. For the boy and his twisted perspective of the world, this man was his hero and became his ideal. A man firmly standing at the top of society, surrounded by loyal followers awaiting his next word with nothing but worship in their eyes. So eventually, he began to imitate his way of speaking and behaving. Money and power had become synonymous to him. But we're still missing one last piece. While everything I've just told you made it pretty obvious that Constanzo wasn't going to end up being a humble and good-natured person, the final straw that broke the camel's back came in the form of what almost every sociopath and serial killer goes through: severe childhood trauma. His adoptive father died unexpectedly, and the family was left homeless. He left them a small inheritance, which they used to move back to Miami, where they had to start from scratch. Our arrogant prince fell from his glass tower, going from being a rich kid respected by his environment to a poor immigrant in a culture he didn't belong to. Needless to say, this severely damaged his fragile ego. Lovely Delia, of course, quickly found a replacement in the form of another unnamed stepfather, who also practiced palo machombe and made a living dealing drugs. Constanzo learned the inner workings of this trade from his new adoptive father, while also helping his mother with shoplifting, once again emphasizing this philosophy of don't let the law or morals interfere with your goals. At this point in his life, Constanzo was only 10 years old. Now that we have a complete picture, let's recap. We have a young man who was exposed to the occult, money, and crime from a very young age, convinced that he was superior to others and had spiritual powers by his mother, who also taught him that empathy was for the weak, and who suffered a severe traumatic event at a very young age, which came with the constant stress caused by the lack of stability in his family and place of residence. Therefore, as an adult, we're left with a person with the following traits: obsession with money and power, delusions of grandeur, deep belief in the occult, lack of empathy, disgust with anything that could be considered weak, need to constantly feel in control, sadism, considers himself superior to the rest of humanity, has absolutely no regard for the law or morality. If you're a member of my audience, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that this profile fits perfectly with that of a textbook sociopath, but the biggest difference between him and conventional sociopaths is that this behavior was actively encouraged by his environment. Instead of showing concern or being alarmed, his mother was extremely proud of her son and believed that these were the qualities every palero should possess. Therefore, his horrendous personality progressively escalated into complete cruelty and megalomania, to absolutely no one's surprise. During the next few years of his life, Constanzo primarily devoted himself to crime and the occult. He was arrested several times for theft and vandalism. But that wasn't all. He also dealt drugs and associated with cartel members who imported them from Mexico. His other way of generating income was helping his mother with her work as the local witch. To be precise, they read fortunes using tarot cards, cast protection spells against curses and bad luck, and made amulets that brought money, love, good luck, and so on. They did everything you'd expect from people who call themselves witches and live off it. Through both of these quote-unquote businesses, he managed to establish himself as a very effective and charismatic witch in Miami's criminal community, making important connections with members of Mexican cartels in the process. He barely graduated from high school, but was later expelled from prep school for bad behavior. Now, who would have thought that a sociopath arrested for multiple crimes would have attitude problems? The ever-wise and kind-hearted Delia decided to celebrate the occasion by giving her son the opportunity to travel with a palero known as El Grande, which means the Great One in Spanish, to learn more about the religion and be officially initiated into it through a ritual called rayamiento, which translates literally to stripe making. This is where things start to take a sinister turn. You see, this initiation ritual is not like your average baptism. It must be performed on a night with a waxing moon. The initiate is immersed in cold water mixed with various herbs, then dressed only in white pants and a scarf over their head, blindfolded, and guided to the center of an empty room, so that they stand above a symbol drawn by the person conducting the ceremony. In front of the initiate, a cauldron is placed said to contain the spirit of a deceased person or deity. whom they ask for protection and swear an oath to pay tribute to. 2 roosters are sacrificed, and their blood is placed inside the cauldron. Once the moon reaches its fullest light, the ceremony begins. Razors or knives are used to make cuts on the initiate's skin. These are usually made on the chests, arms, and shoulders, but depending on the person performing the ritual, they can also be made on the legs and the tongue. First, cuts are made in the shape of straight lines. These are the so-called stripes, from which the ritual gets its name. Then into crosses, and finally into more elaborate designs, such as symbols. The initiate is left to bleed for hours, the purpose being to allow the spirits of the dead to enter their body through the open wounds. When the person in charge of the ritual deems that enough time has passed, the initiate's blood is collected and placed inside the cauldron to strengthen their bond with the entity residing within. Finally, the wounds are covered with a paste made from powdered human bones, rum, chili, and garlic. You heard me right, they use real human bones. Once the ritual is complete, the blindfold is removed from the initiate's eyes and they must worship the moon before heading to the nearest cemetery to further connect with the spirits of the dead. The sharp pain the initiates experience is a test to determine if they have enough strength and metal to be Apaleo. Once again, showcasing the religion's emphasis on strength over every other trait. Just to be clear, this ritual varies depending on the person performing it. For example, 3 roosters may be sacrificed instead of 2, or it may be other animals. But the elements that are always present in some kind of form are the animal sacrifice, the cuts on the skin, the cauldron, and the human bones. Constanzo underwent this rayamiento at the beginning of his journey and once more at the end. It is unknown where he was or what he did in the approximately 3 years that he was under the guidance of El Grande. We don't know exactly what he learned, nor what rituals were passed down to him, but once he returned, Constanzo began to incorporate human sacrifices instead of animal ones in his ceremonies. When he turned 21, Constanzo moved to Mexico City and worked as a model for a time. However, his true goal was to start a business performing spiritual work as a witch. Making use of his previous contacts with members of Mexican cartels, he began to ingratiate himself in Mexico's criminal underworld and became known as a prophet with extraordinary powers. You may find it strange for crime and the occult to be so closely related, but there is a reason, one that's twofold. First, there's something you need to understand about Latin American cultures. The idea of spirits, energies, and other supernatural entities meddling in daily affairs is something that is deeply ingrained within our culture. Of course, not to the same degree as Constanzo and his mother, but, well, to give you an example, when you get a headache, it's common to hear comments like, maybe someone cursed you from those around you, even if they are Catholic or not normally superstitious. I'm speaking in general, obviously, since me personally and many others don't believe in anything supernatural, but overall, it's a cultural thing. This also means that every Latin American country has its own local version of Palo Mashombe. And secondly, keeping that cultural context in mind, hitmen and drug traffickers also need something to believe in, especially considering the world they live in. But they can't exactly go to a church and ask a priest to bless their product so it sells well in another country, or to offer a prayer that will protect them from the law. And that's where religions like Palo Mashombe come into the equation, since there is no such notion of good or evil in this religion, and consultations with its priests, called tatas, are done privately and under an oath of silence. It's perfect for easing the minds of superstitious criminals. Constanzo often performed rituals to ensure a certain cartel's business would go well, to keep the police from finding their operation, and to cast curses on rival gangs. And believe you me, he made a fortune doing it. Once the rumors of a very powerful witch who had helped certain cartels with their businesses began to spread, it didn't take long for even more clients to start coming in, which aside from the aforementioned cartels, included celebrities, corrupt police officers, and even politicians. As you can imagine, his earnings multiplied exponentially, to the point where he could be considered a millionaire. It was at that point in his life that Constanzo decided to start his own family. His financial success had given him the necessary reputation to attract all kinds of people willing to learn from him and follow his every order. Now you're probably wondering exactly what I mean by family and why I say that people started to show up willing to become his followers as if it was the completely natural thing to happen. Well, my friend, this is because in Palo Mashombe, this is completely natural. Paleros don't have a church or similar building where the faithful gather, but rather are organized into different houses of worship or families that operate independently. It's a religion structure exactly like an organized crime syndicate. There are no scriptures or centralized doctrine, everything is transmitted orally. So, if you want to be a palero, you have no choice but to join one of these families and gain the approval of its leader, who is called, and I'm being serious here, the Godfather. Each family interprets the religion however they wish and have their own rituals. The only thing they have in common is that they all worship the dead and have a cauldron with human bones housing a spirit to whom they offer sacrifices in exchange for their service. But disregarding that, each group's ceremonies and practices rely exclusively on the word of the Godfather, and the word of the Godfather is absolute. Once you become part of a family, you cannot disobey the leader, lest you want the spirits to whom you are outbound to turn against you, or the other members to resort to violence. It's literally like joining the mob or a cult, but this is completely normal in the world of Palo. These are just the rules. If you want to learn more about the religion and practice it, you have to join a family. And if you want to be part of a family, you have to obey the Godfather. This is how it works to this day. So, while it may seem like Constanzo created a cult out of thin air, he actually took advantage of the existing structure of Palo Mashombe to form a group and shaped it in the way he wanted to. He didn't convince people to join him by claiming to be the son of God or any other such nonsense. Rather, this system of families already existed in the first place. Knowing this, it's not difficult to understand how Constanzo was able to quickly incorporate a great amount of members into his family and practice increasingly grotesque and elaborate rituals, obviously making use of human sacrifices, which eventually became much easier to perform. Over the next 2 years, Constanzo and his family, which had both drug traffickers and police officers as members, left at least 8 confirmed victims, and they were just getting started. In 1987, Constanzo welcomed Elio Hernandez, the leader of a cartel heir to a drug trafficking dynasty, into his family. Now, with the goal of getting into the drug business himself, in addition to offering his services as a witch, he decided to move to Matamoros, a city bordering with Texas, perfect for exporting product to the United States. Elio Hernandez simply gave Constanzo full control over the entire operation because, and let's not forget, the Godfather's word is absolute. In 1988, Constanzo took a woman named Sara Aldrete as his lover and made her second in command of the family, a godmother of sorts. Before moving to Ranch Santa Elena, an isolated place several miles away from the city, perfect for performing rituals undisturbed and to serve as a base for his drug trafficking operation. What I'm about to tell you is a brief overview of what Constanzo and the others did to their victims. But I want you to keep in mind that I'm not going to go case by case. nor am I going to talk to you about any particular individual. The only reason I think it's necessary to include this in the video is to faithfully depict the level of cruelty and depravity that we're dealing with. There are no adjectives that can accurately convey the kind of human waste these people were. For Palo rituals, nothing is more important than a enganga. This is the cauldron with human bones I've been mentioning for a while now. The spirit of the deceased, to whom the bones belong, is supposed to reside in this cauldron. Usually, the bones used are looted from graveyards, but Constanzo believed these spells would be more powerful if he used fresh body parts. The intention behind these killings was to enslave and bind the spirits of the victims inside this cauldron, to get them to perform tasks for the cult. And to ensure that their spirits would obey them after death, they needed to torture and terrorize them as much as possible in life, so that they would carry that fear into the afterlife. The victims were typically kidnapped by members of the cult from around the city. Their age and gender didn't matter, but they tried to find people who were young and athletic, because they believed they would yield stronger souls. Once they were brought to the ranch at knife point, their clothes were removed, their hands and feet tied, and then were slowly carried to the room where the ceremony would take place. They were hung from the ceiling in front of the cauldron, over a symbol drawn on the floor, like literal lamps in a slaughterhouse. They were gradually submerged in boiling water, so that the heat shock wouldn't kill them immediately. After listening to the victims' heart-rending screams of pain, the cultists would use the rope tied to the ceiling to pull them out, before submerging them again, repeating the process several more times. Then, the family members would proceed to make cuts all over the victim to collect the blood in dishes for later consumption, in addition to placing it in the enganga, and then they would begin the slow process of removing body parts and throwing them into the cauldron. Once the victim was on the verge of death, they would rip their hearts out and eat it in front of them, to ensure that the last thing they saw before death was an image of their own heart being devoured between laughs by these pieces of. As for the methods and tools they used, I'll leave those details to your imagination. All you need to know is that they got very creative when it came to mutilation. At least 21 confirmed people were slaughtered in this way, one after the other, simply to become part of Constanzo's alleged collection of spirits, simply to keep his clients coming, and simply to ward off bad luck. Those were the only reasons they needed to commit these atrocities again and again. Do you understand now why I say that no adjective would suffice to describe the enormity of the crimes committed by these wastes of oxygen? Do you understand now why I consider this one of the most barbaric cases in Mexican history? If you're a person as cynical as I am, you're probably thinking, if these guys had the support of both politicians and cartel members, that means they were virtually untouchable. And you'd be right, protected by both the light and shadow of Mexican society. These people could have gone on like this for decades on end, without anyone knowing. But they made a big mistake. On March 14, 1989, Constanzo ordered his followers to find him an American. He used the word gringo, which is a sort of slur that Latinos use for Americans. He wanted one of the college students who were spending their spring break in Matamoros at the time. Constanzo wanted the brain of an American who was in college because, according to him, it would produce a smarter and more capable spirit. So that same day, they kidnapped and murdered Mark Kilroy during one of their rituals and placed his body parts in the cauldron. This young man came from a prestigious family with connections to politicians in the US, who, upon learning of their son's disappearance, did not just sit idly by. This led to the case becoming public knowledge and the United States government beginning to put pressure on then President Salinas. At the time, Mexico was in tremendous debt to American banks and was being harshly criticized by the DEA for being so lax with the cartels that routinely exported drugs across the border. So, they had no choice but, after 21 fucking victims, actively start the search for the ones behind the Matamoros disappearances, which were already known to everyone in the city, including the local police department. As if to add insult to injury, it took them no time at all to arrest 4 members of Constanzo's family and force them to take them to the ranch, where they confessed to absolutely everything. The authorities discovered the brain and several human remains inside the cauldron in the ritual room. And later, 15 horribly disfigured bodies were unearthed from freshly dug graves in the surrounding area, among which the body of Mark Kilroy was identified. Constanzo was now a wanted man and decided to flee to the capital with some of his followers and a large amount of cash. By pure chance, a couple of officers heard a disturbance near the apartment where Constanzo was staying at. Upon seeing them approaching through the window, he mistakenly thought he had been discovered and made the very prudent and rational decision to start shooting at them with a machine gun. Naturally, the officers quickly called for reinforcements and prepared to apprehend the madman who was shooting at them through the window. Constanzo didn't want to go to prison, so he took the following course of action. First, he threw bundles of American dollars out the window to cause a commotion and stall for time. Then, he handed the gun to one of his followers and ordered him to shoot him in the head. Once again, the Godfather's word is absolute. A total of 14 cult members were arrested and convicted of various crimes. The lightest sentences were of 30 years, while the most involved members, like Sara Aldrete, were sentenced to 60 years. They remain in prison to this day, with little to no chance of ever being released on parole. So, were you able to find a satisfactory answer? Let me ask you again, why do you think the concept of power is so often linked to the concept of evil? What is power, and what is evil for you? Did the events I just described bring you closer to finding an answer? If so, I'd love to read it in the comments. I want to thank you for listening until the end. As always, my friend, much love, and I hope you're alright. If I was 18, I would want to be dead.